She went into the woods to prove she wasn't afraid anymore, and the woods decided to teach her what fear really was. My name is Elena Brooks. I'm 34, and I thought spending a week alone in the forests of Northern California would help me reclaim control over my life. After years of anxiety and sleepless nights, I wanted to face isolation head-on, to sit with silence until it stopped threatening me. I didn't understand that some silences are alive. I chose a remote stretch near the Klamath National Forest, far from campsites and popular trails. I told one person where I'd be, left my phone mostly off to conserve battery, and drove until cell service disappeared completely. The forest welcomed me with towering redwoods and a soft carpet of needles that muted every sound. It felt ancient, steady, reassuring. I felt small in a good way, like nothing bad could reach me out here. The first day passed without incident. I hiked, collected firewood, cooked a simple meal, and watched the sun sink behind the trees. Shadows stretched long and slow, and the air cooled quickly. When darkness arrived, it wasn't abrupt. It crept in gently, as if the forest was tucking itself in. I sat by the fire, calm, breathing deeply, proud of myself for being alone and unafraid. That feeling lasted until the fire began to die. As the flames shrank, the darkness pressed closer. The trees no longer felt like scenery, they felt like walls. I added more wood, but the fire refused to grow the way it had before. The light barely reached beyond my immediate circle. Everything outside it vanished into blackness. I laughed softly, trying to keep my nerves in check, and told myself this was what I'd come for. That's when I heard footsteps. They weren't close, not at first. They sounded far off, deep in the forest, slow and deliberate. I stopped moving and listened. The steps paused, as if whatever made them realized I was listening too. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear. Still, the way the sound resumed felt wrong. It adjusted its pace to match my breathing. I stood and shone my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through branches and trunks, illuminating nothing but bark and shadow. No eyes, no movement. When I lowered the light, the footsteps stopped again. I suddenly felt foolish for being scared and returned to the fire, but my appetite was gone. When I crawled into my tent, I zipped it fully and lay on my back staring into darkness. The forest sounds returned slowly, but they felt staged, too perfectly timed. Every crack and rustle made me tense. I forced my eyes shut and tried to sleep. Sometime later, I woke to the sound of breathing. It wasn't mine. It came from just outside the tent, slow and steady, like someone standing there patiently. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sound circled the tent once, then stopped directly in front of me. The fabric pressed inward slightly, as if something leaned close. Then it spoke. Elena. My name slid through the air like a memory, quiet but unmistakable. I sat up, heart pounding violently, and whispered, "Who's there?" The breathing stopped. Silence returned, deeper than before. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it against the tent wall. A shadow appeared, tall and distorted, stretching unnaturally across the fabric. I screamed and kicked forward, bursting out of the tent and into the clearing. The flashlight beam shook as I swung it around wildly. Nothing stood there, no footprints, no movement. Just trees, unmoving and dark. The fire had gone out completely. I packed in a panic, deciding to leave immediately. Staying felt dangerous in a way I couldn't explain. I shouldered my pack and followed the trail back toward where I'd parked. But after half an hour, I recognized the same fallen log I'd passed earlier. I turned around and walked faster, only to find my campsite again, exactly as I'd left it. The forest had folded in on itself. My breathing grew ragged. I tried different directions, different paths, but every route led me back. The woods didn't feel confusing, they felt intentional, like they were guiding me where they wanted me to be. The whisper returned, drifting through the trees. "Elena, you're doing so well." The voice sounded almost kind. Branches snapped nearby, closer now. I ran blindly, tripping over roots and rocks, skin tearing against thorns. No matter how fast I ran, I could hear the footsteps behind me, never rushing, never falling behind. They knew I would tire before they did. I burst into another clearing and froze. Someone was standing there. She looked like me. Same height, same hair, same clothes. But her movements were wrong, slightly delayed, like a reflection struggling to keep up. Her eyes were empty, dark pools that reflected no light. She smiled slowly, stretching her mouth too wide. "You left something behind," she said in my voice. I screamed and turned to run, but the trees closed in. Branches bent and twisted, blocking my path. Hands grabbed at me from the darkness, cold and insistent. The duplicate stepped closer, tilting her head with curiosity. "We keep the ones who come alone," she whispered. "They're easier to remember." I fought, screaming, clawing, until exhaustion overwhelmed me. The forest seemed to breathe around me, inhaling deeply. Everything went black. I woke at dawn on the edge of a dirt road, my body covered in scratches and bruises. My gear was gone. My shoes were missing. I staggered toward the road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver didn't ask many questions. He just looked at me with something like recognition. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "Most don't make it back out." I never returned to the woods. I moved to the city, surrounded myself with noise and people and light. But sometimes, late at night, when I catch my reflection in a dark window, it moves a second too late. And I hear footsteps in my dreams, steady and patient, following me through trees that never end. Because the woods didn't lose me that night. They let me go. What starts as a peaceful solo hike turns into a nightmare when the shadows of the trees begin following her steps, and the forest starts whispering things it should never know. My name is Hannah Moore. I'm 31, and I went into the Olympic National Forest in Washington because I wanted to disappear for a while without actually vanishing. I thought the woods would be quiet, indifferent, safe. I was wrong. I arrived just before sunset, parking my car near an old, barely used trailhead. The forest towered above me, massive trees blotting out the sky, their trunks thick and ancient, like they had been standing there long before memory. I checked my map, adjusted my backpack, and stepped onto the trail, feeling calm for the first time in months. The air smelled damp and green, and the silence felt welcoming. The deeper I walked, the darker it became. Even before night fully fell, the canopy swallowed most of the light. I noticed something strange then. The forest didn't sound alive the way forests usually do. No birds, no insects. Just the faint sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. It felt like everything else had stopped to listen. I set up my tent near what looked like a dry stream. It wasn't ideal, but daylight was fading fast. I made a small fire and ate quietly, staring into the flames. The woods around me seemed closer now, like the trees had shifted inward while I wasn't looking. I laughed nervously at myself and blamed fatigue. That's when I heard footsteps. Not random, not scattered. Slow and deliberate, matching my own pace from earlier. They circled just beyond the firelight. I stood up, heart pounding, and called out, "Hello?" My flashlight rested in my hand, its beam trembling as I scanned the fabric walls. Every sound felt amplified. Every breath felt too loud. Around midnight, the whispering started. At first, it was impossible to understand, just soft murmurs layered together, like many voices trying to speak at once. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself it was wind. Then one word separated itself from the rest. "Hannah!" My eyes snapped open. My name drifted through the trees, stretched and distorted, spoken by something that didn't use lungs. I sat up, heart slamming so hard it hurt. I whispered back without meaning to, "Who's there?" The forest answered with silence. Then the whispers resumed, closer now, circling my tent. I could hear breathing, slow and controlled, right outside the fabric. The ground shifted under unseen weight. I watched a shadow slide across the tent wall, tall and narrow, bending unnaturally, as if its joints didn't align correctly. The zipper of the tent twitched. I screamed and kicked forward, bursting out of the tent and into the clearing. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness wildly. Nothing stood there. No footprints, no movement. Just trees, endless trees, but the feeling didn't leave. It pressed against me from all sides, heavy and aware. I grabbed my backpack and decided to leave immediately. I didn't care if it was the middle of the night. Staying felt like surrender. I followed the trail back the way I came, or at least I thought I did. After 20 minutes, I reached the same dried stream. My abandoned fire pit stared back at me like an accusation. My stomach dropped. I tried a different direction. Same result. The forest wasn't letting me go. The whispering returned, clearer now, more confident. "Hannah, you came alone." The trees creaked as if responding. Branches bent inward. Shadows pulled at the edges of my vision. I ran blindly, tripping, falling, scraping my hands raw against bark and stone. No matter where I turned, the forest folded back onto itself. Then I saw lights. A cabin stood ahead, small and crooked, half swallowed by vines. Relief flooded me. I rushed toward it, pounding on the door. No answer. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was stale. Dust coated everything. Old furniture sat rotting, but the place didn't feel abandoned. It felt occupied, watching. Behind me, the door closed. The whispering filled the room, no longer distant, no longer layered. It spoke as one voice now. "We learn the ones who walk alone." The shadows peeled away from the walls, stretching upward into tall, human-like shapes. They moved without sound, surrounding me. I swung my flashlight wildly, but the beam passed through them like smoke. Cold seeped into my bones. My vision blurred. I backed against the wall, sobbing, knife raised uselessly. The shapes leaned closer, their forms sharpening just enough for me to understand what they were becoming: imperfect copies of me. My posture, my height, my face blurred and unfinished. One of them reached out. I screamed and shoved past them, bursting through the door as it flew open. People go missing out there, he said quietly. Mostly hikers who go alone. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I hear it again. Soft footsteps, familiar breathing, and a whisper from somewhere far too close. Hannah, you never really left. She went into the forest for solitude, but something had been waiting for her name long before she arrived. My name is Clara Hayes. I'm 26, and I thought a solo camping trip in the Montana wilderness would give me peace. The city had drained me lights, traffic, noise, but the mountains promised quiet. I packed carefully, mapped the trails, and told friends I'd be unreachable. Nothing in my life had prepared me for the forest itself. The first hours were perfect. Mist clung to the ground, sunlight filtered through dense pine, and I walked for miles, reveling in the crisp air and the crunch of needles underfoot. I finally found a small clearing by a creek, set up camp, and built a fire. Dinner was simple, but I felt safe. The air smelled clean, fresh. It was everything I had hoped for. Night fell quickly. Darkness poured over the trees like ink. The forest, so welcoming during the day, became oppressive, alive. I lit my lantern, listening to the gentle sounds of water and wind. Then, a twig snapped somewhere near the edge of the clearing. My stomach clenched. I told myself it was an animal, deer, raccoon, nothing more. But the sound was deliberate, too slow, too measured. I lay in my sleeping bag, gripping my knife and trying to breathe normally. That's when I heard it, a soft whisper, impossibly close. Clara, my name, spoken by no human I knew. I sat up, heart hammering, eyes wide in the glow of the lantern. Shadows seemed to shift around the perimeter of my camp, elongating unnaturally, moving against the wind. I whispered back, voice shaking, "Hello?" Silence answered, and yet the feeling of being watched intensified. I decided to check the perimeter with my flashlight. The beam scanned the trees, the creek, the rocky ground, but nothing moved. No footprints, no animals. Just the forest, quiet and patient, holding its breath. I returned to my tent, trying to convince myself that exhaustion and imagination were playing tricks on me. Yet the unease lingered, like eyes on the back of my neck. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate, circling the clearing. My blood ran cold. They weren't human. I could feel the pace, methodical, synchronized with my own racing heart. I froze, clutching my knife, breathing shallow. The steps stopped briefly, then resumed, closer now, scraping over roots and rocks, moving toward my tent. I could hear the leaves shift under invisible weight. The zipper at the tent entrance trembled. I held my breath, praying it was a branch brushing against the canvas. The movement stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. Then came the whisper again. Clara. Closer, clearer. I realized it knew me. Not my voice, not my scent, but my very presence. It had been waiting for me. Panic surged. I threw off the sleeping bag and bolted, stumbling into the snow-covered ground outside. Branches clawed at my arms and face. My heart felt like it would explode. I didn't care about direction. I just ran. The forest twisted unnaturally around me. Trails I had mapped during the day now led in impossible loops. The creek appeared multiple times, as if the forest itself were mocking me. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, tall and thin, and followed me. It didn't run, it didn't need to. It moved with patience, keeping its distance but always within sight. I couldn't escape. Every turn brought me back to the same clearing, the same creek, the same fire I had abandoned. My lungs burned. My legs ached. Fear was all-consuming. I stumbled into an abandoned cabin, unseen on my map. Windows boarded, door ajar. Inside, dust hung in the air. Broken furniture, shadows stretched unnaturally in the lantern light. I hid behind a chair, knife in hand. The whispering returned, overlapping, echoing in the wooden walls. Clara, Clara, Clara. The voice was layered, multiplied, omnipresent. The door slammed shut behind me. I hadn't moved it. Cold air rushed in. The shadows pooled in the center of the room, growing darker, thicker. My name echoed through the cabin again, and then I saw it. A shape, impossibly tall, featureless, leaning toward me. It didn't need eyes to see me. I could feel its awareness pressing down, suffocating. I screamed, lunging for the door. It held firm. I tried the windows, locked. I was trapped. The creature moved closer, the temperature dropping, my breath forming clouds in front of my face. I pressed my back against the wall, knife trembling in my hand. Every instinct screamed to run. My body refused to comply. Dawn broke slowly, piercing the boarded windows with gray light. The shadow receded, the door unlocked. I bolted outside, sprinting blindly through the forest. The snow covered all traces of my footsteps, and for the first time, I doubted whether the cabin had ever existed. But the memory of the whispering, the eyes, the waiting, burned in my mind. Hours later, I reached a logging road and flagged down the trucker. He listened to my story, pale, nodding. "You're lucky to get out. The forest. It keeps people sometimes, waiting, learning. Not everyone leaves." I returned to the city, but sleep never came easily. At night, I imagined the snow crunching under invisible boots, whispers trailing my name, shadows sliding across walls. Sometimes I dream of the cabin, the creek, the whispering. Sometimes I wake to find snow on my doorstep, no matter the season. I know I shouldn't have gone alone. I know the forest doesn't forgive curiosity. I know that it's still out there, waiting for me to return. And every time I hear my name whispered, I remember that I was never truly alone in the woods. The new year was supposed to be a fresh start for Elara. She'd packed her meager belongings into her beat-up sedan, leaving behind the suffocating confines of her small, Midwestern town and a past she desperately wanted to forget. California, that was the dream. A place where the sun always shone and shadows couldn't cling to you quite so easily. But as she drove, mile after weary mile across the vast, indifferent landscape of America, a cold front had followed her, bringing with it an unseasonable chill and a creeping sense of dread. Her final destination was a remote cabin nestled deep in the Redwood National Park, a place she'd found on an obscure vacation rental site. It was cheap, secluded, and promised a digital detox, precisely what she needed to truly escape. The owner, a cryptic woman named Agnes, had left the key under a welcome mat and a handwritten note. "Enjoy the peace and mind the silence." Elara arrived on December 30th, the twilight casting long, skeletal shadows of the ancient redwoods across the winding dirt road. The cabin itself was charmingly rustic, if a little too isolated for comfort. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just the overwhelming silence Agnes had warned about. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the occasional unsettling creak of the old house. New Year's Eve dawned gray and damp. Elara spent the day unpacking, making a fire, and trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She told herself it was just the isolation, the sheer unfamiliarity of it all. As darkness fell, she prepared a simple meal, lit candles, and poured herself a glass of wine, determined to welcome the new year with a semblance of normalcy. At midnight, the forest outside erupted in an unsettling symphony of howls. Not wolves, not coyotes, something deeper, more guttural, more human. Elara froze, her wine glass clattering to the table. The howls continued, circling the cabin, growing louder, closer. She pressed herself against the door, heart hammering, straining to hear over her own ragged breathing. Then came the scratching. Faint at first, like twigs against the wooden planks, then intensifying, rhythmic, insistent. It was coming from the window in the living room. She crept towards it, peering through the gap in the heavy curtains. Nothing, just the inky blackness of the forest, the redwoods standing like silent sentinels. She scoffed at herself, her fear making her paranoid. It was just the wind, she decided, the old house settling. But the scratching moved. Now it was at the back door, then the bedroom window. It felt less like random noise and more like a deliberate probing, as if something was testing the integrity of her sanctuary. She spent the rest of the night huddled by the fireplace, a heavy poker clutched in her hand, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin. When the first sliver of dawn finally appeared, painting the sky in weak, watery hues, the scratching stopped. The howls faded into the distance. Elara felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, but beneath it, a new, chilling fear had taken root. The next day, January 1st, was no less unnerving. The silence had returned, but it felt heavier, laden with unspoken threats. Elara tried to distract herself, reading an old novel she'd found on a dusty shelf, but her eyes kept darting to the windows. She felt watched, a constant, unsettling gaze from beyond the glass. In the afternoon, while exploring the cabin, she noticed a small, intricately carved wooden box on a high shelf in the pantry. It looked ancient, almost like a relic. Curiosity overcoming her apprehension, she reached for it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves, was a collection of yellowed photographs. They were old, black and white, depicting families, couples, individuals, all posing stiffly in front of the very cabin she was staying in. Their faces were smiling, but their eyes seemed to hold a hint of unease, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. As she shuffled through them, one photograph in particular caught her attention. A woman, strikingly similar to Elara herself, stood at the cabin's threshold, a hopeful smile on her face. But what chilled Elara to the bone was the date scrawled on the back, December 31st, 1967, and beneath it, in faint, almost erased script, she didn't make it to the new year. A cold knot formed in Elara's stomach. She looked closer at the woman's eyes in the photo. They held that same unsettling glint, a silent plea that had gone unheeded for decades. She dropped the photos, her hands trembling. The cabin, which had felt merely isolated, now felt like a trap. She tried her phone again, desperately, knowing it was futile, no signal. She needed to leave, now. She grabbed her keys, her bag, and rushed towards the door. But as her hand reached for the doorknob, she heard it again. The scratching. This time it wasn't outside. It was coming from inside the walls. Faint, scuttling sounds, like tiny clawed things moving within the plaster, growing steadily louder. Panic surged through her. She yanked the door open, but the heavy wooden frame seemed to resist, as if held by an unseen force. She pulled harder, straining, her muscles burning. The scratching intensified, all around her now, in the floorboards, the ceiling, the very air. Through the narrow crack in the door, she glimpsed a figure standing amidst the towering redwoods. It was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in what looked like tattered ancient clothes. Its face was obscured by shadow, but she felt its gaze, cold and predatory, fixated on her. "You can't leave," a voice whispered, though no lips moved. It was a chorus of voices, ancient and decaying, echoing in her mind. Not yet. Not on New Year's Day. Alara screamed, a raw, primal sound that was swallowed by the immense silence of the forest. She pushed with all her might, finally forcing the door open enough to squeeze through. She scrambled down the steps, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the chilling whispers chasing her. She fumbled for her car keys, her hands shaking so violently she could barely insert them into the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. She jammed the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel, and sped down the dirt road. In her rearview mirror, she saw the cabin shrinking, receding into the oppressive shadow of the redwoods. But something else was there. Standing at the threshold, where she had been just moments before, was the figure, and beside it, another. And another, all impossibly tall, unnervingly still. They were waiting. Alara didn't stop driving until the redwoods were a distant memory, until she was back on the paved highway, bathed in the comforting glow of streetlights. But even then, the whispers lingered, a faint echo of, "You can't leave," and a memory of those chilling, empty eyes. She never looked back, never returned to the cabin. But every New Year's Eve, as the clock ticks towards midnight, Alara finds herself listening. Listening for the howls, for the scratching, for the silent promise of those who couldn't leave, still waiting for another chance to claim their new year.